Thank you for not being shitty there. I set you up with the perfect opportunity to be shitty to me, and you took the high ground, and I appreciate that. Welcome to another episode of the Nerds You're Looking For podcast, a weekly nerd culture podcast that discusses nerddom through various segments. You can find us at thenerdspodcast.com and can follow us on Instagram and Twitter through our handle at thenerdspodcast. If you'd like to reach us directly, including sending us suggestions for our nerd favorite segment, you can email us at thenerdsyou'relooking4@gmail.com. Additionally, we have a YouTube page under the Nerds You're Looking For banner, and each of us have a Letterboxd account, which is basically social media for watching movies. I'm at that Tyler Hunt, and my co-host Pat can be found at the Nerds Podcast. With all of that being said, and without further ado, alongside me as always is my co-host Pat Attack. How's it going, man?
I am fantastic, man. I don't want to dwell too much on this, but for those that have been listening for a while now, you guys know I'm a huge Chicago Bears fan, and they just clinched the division earlier today, so I'm super psyched. Literally, we're recording this a little bit later than we normally do. We normally record before the first wave of games, but because you had to work this weekend, we had to record afterwards. So I literally went from my buddy Mike's house straight home, and I basically sat down and we started recording. So I'm super jacked from the game. I know we don't talk about it a lot because we don't want to mix sports with nerd culture, but yeah, I'm super jacked because they just won the division. I may or may not have spent $100 on division champ merchandise after the game.
That's silly.
And I was just telling my wife when I got home, I was like, yeah, because in a couple of weeks, if they lose in the first round of the playoffs, I'm going to be wearing that shit all the time. Just kidding. I'm never going to wear it again.
Yeah, it was a pretty good weekend for my sports stuff too. So the Pacers won Friday, IU won with a buzzer beater yesterday, and then the Colts shut out the Cowboys today. So as long as the Pacers win again tonight, it'll be a pretty good weekend.
But yeah, it's been an interesting weekend. I basically played Red Dead for most of the weekend. Literally I went and saw Spider-Man on Thursday, and then we went and saw Aquaman. I forgot the title of the movie, which bodes well for our review later on in the episode. But we went and saw that Saturday night. We saw the Amazon Prime early showing Saturday, but I've literally, other than those two things, the last 3 or 4 days, all I've done is played Red Dead the entire time. So it's been a pretty good weekend.
Yeah, must be nice. All I've been doing is working. I mean, anybody else who works in retail knows that it's fucking showtime, and we've got whenever this releases, it will be pretty much exactly a week until Christmas. So just got to stick it out for another week, and then it's all clear. So on Xbox, I don't know if you know about this feature, but it'll show you all your stats for every game that you play, and it will also show you where you rank within your friends in that game. And I think the last time I checked, I was third on all my friends who play Red Dead. I've put 40 hours into it, and you have 10 minutes or something. You barely played this game. It's not 10 minutes, but I played it 2.5 hours. But yeah, I
know, but yeah, I was over exaggerating, I guess, or under exaggerating, whatever you want to say. But yeah, it's kind of sad because I know how much you loved the original game and how much you were looking forward to this game, and it's just kind of sad seeing you're ranked 6th out of all my friends playing this game. There's only 6 friends that I have on Xbox that have played this game.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to January. It'll be a month to kind of get caught back up on some of the content that I've missed out on. I've fallen behind on a few shows I watch, and then of course from a video game perspective, I have a lot to get caught up, especially with Red Dead. So I'm looking forward to getting over this hump and getting back into it in the first of the year.
Yeah, for sure. So if this is your first episode, we're going to do things a little bit different this particular episode. So like I said, we're going to be reviewing Aquaman. We were able to see it a week early because of Amazon Prime. They do this every once in a while. I think the last time it benefited us, or it may actually have been the last time they did it, was last year. They showed Jumanji Welcome to the Jungle a week early. So that worked out really well for us at the time. And this one definitely works out for us because this episode, our main topic would have been what we're going to talk about here in a little bit, which is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. But since Aquaman, we were able to see Aquaman a week early, and we're not actually going to have an episode next week, we were like, well, let's double up and kind of do two reviews. So we're going to kind of do a miniature review of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and then do our main topic, which is Aquaman, which I'm assuming that's the reason that Amazon and Warner Brothers got together and were like, hey, let's have an early screening so these guys don't miss out on their Aquaman review. I'm assuming. I mean, the only way they're going to make up their money for this Aquaman movie is if all of our listeners go and see it. So they had to have the little nerd you're looking for bump. So that's the only logical explanation. So, I'm really excited to talk about Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and I'm surprisingly excited to talk about Aquaman as well, but I think that also might be because I'm still jacked from the division title. So that could be just a tiny bit of it. So yeah, we're going to kind of double up on Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Normally, like I said, Tyler talks about something and I talk about a different thing. But for what we're into this particular week, we're going to double up. So if you're not aware, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is an animated movie that centers around the Ultimate Spider-Man, Miles Morales, who isn't actually the Ultimate Spider-Man. At the beginning of this movie, he's just a regular teenager going to high school and what have you. And then he gets, like Peter Parker, gets bitten by a radioactive spider. And while he's kind of trying to figure out his powers, he becomes involved in this incident between Spider-Man, Peter Parker, and Kingpin, among others. During this incident, a portal gets opened that opens up basically a bunch of these other dimensions, during which a bunch of other spider people get pulled into Miles Morales' dimension, and those spider people alongside Miles Morales must figure out how to not only close that portal, but also get these spider people home at the same time. So normally what we do with our main topic is, and when we're reviewing a movie, we kind of talk about our expectations going into these movies. And I will say, just if this is your first episode, like we always talk about, like Stan Lee said, every comic is somebody's first comic. So if this is your first episode and you haven't heard me talk about my Spider-Man fandom, I will say that if I hadn't gotten into Spider-Man as a kid and TMNT as a kid, I definitely wouldn't be sitting here right now. So, Spider-Man animated movie from the guys that did the Lego movie and 21 Jump Street. Like, I love those movies. So I was all in. Like, I was super excited for this movie. I think it was, I don't know if it was my first pick or maybe like my second pick for a Rotten Tomatoes film draft, which is looking pretty good right now. Or at least this movie is looking pretty good. I haven't tallied up my actual percentage yet, but I'm pretty sure I need the Dark Phoenix to be in like the 90% for me to win at this point. But yeah, I was definitely really psyched to see this movie.
Yeah, I mean, I was excited as well. I will say that whenever they announced this movie, I kind of rolled my eyes because obviously Sony does not have an amazing history with the character. And for me, I'm not a huge fan of multiple universes and multiverses and comic books. So I kind of rolled my eyes whenever it sounded like they were adapting that for this film. And I will say, like, as the trailer was released, I thought that it looked really good. And then obviously it's been getting a ton of amazing buzz leading up to the movie. So by the time I went to see it Friday night, I was pretty jazzed, but I definitely didn't start that way.
Yeah, and I was very curious to see how they were going to do this. So I guess in a way, it's kind of loosely based on the Spider-Verse event that they had a few years ago, but I don't know, like, legally, if Marvel owns that. Like, I don't know how that whole deal with Sony and Marvel goes. So I'm not sure if they could necessarily do that beat for beat. Plus, if you're not aware, in the comics, the Spider-Verse event that I'm referring to, there are these creatures that jump from dimension to dimension and eat the spider people in those dimensions. And that's like, essentially they're vampires, and that's how they sustain themselves. And this is an animated movie, which we've talked about this before. Like, they're not necessarily always just for kids, but that's their core demographic, and they're not going to have vampires eating spider people in this movie. So I was very curious to see what they were going to do with it. And I mean, I guess spoiler for our discussion here for what we're into, but I was very happy with what they did.
Well, that makes one of us. No, I'm kidding.
I was like, you can't not like this movie, right?
No, I mean, this movie's fucking
You had me
amazing.
for like a split second.
Yeah, I couldn't even hold it. I wasn't even going to try to hold it because I love this movie as well, and we're going to get into it, but it's pretty awesome. It's pretty great.
Yeah, so I guess just like general overview, broad strokes, how'd you feel about Into Spider-Verse?
So not only is it a really well put together movie, but it is the best reflection of a comic book ever put on film, in my opinion. This is a love letter to comics, and it's a love letter to Spider-Man, and seeing as I'm a huge fan of both of those, obviously I was head over heels for this movie.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the point that you just made. Obviously, we've gotten to the point in pop culture where comic book movies are the big blockbusters. And when we say comic book movies, we mean movies that are based on comic book properties. But this is the closest we'll ever get to an actual comic book coming to life. Just the style of this movie felt like we were literally watching a comic book come to life. And what I loved, other than that, is, among other things, I guess, is the fact that it was a Spider-Man movie for every generation of Spider-Man fans. Like, I'm not a huge Miles Morales fan. I'm not a fan of him. It's just that I have my Peter Parker. I have my Spider-Man, which is Peter Parker. And there's a generation of, I don't know if it's necessarily just comic fans or just Spider-Man fans in general, that Miles Morales is their Spider-Man. And I don't like scoff at them. That's fine. Like, if you had the reaction that I had to Peter Parker as Spider-Man, similar with Miles Morales. I said that really weird. Basically, if you had the same connection to Miles Morales as I did to Peter Parker, then that's awesome. Like, more the merrier, as far as I'm concerned. So there's Miles Morales in this movie. There's Peter Parker. There's a couple of different versions of Peter Parker. There's Gwen Stacy, Spider-Gwen. Like, there's so many things for so many Spider-Man fans in this movie. And I just loved every bit of it. There wasn't one beat from this movie that I didn't like.
Awesome.
All right, so story-wise, how'd you feel about Into the Spider-Verse?
I mean, from a story perspective, the plot is so excellently Spider-Man, and like we both just said in broad strokes, it's so comic booky that it just resonates so well with fans like us. It's about weird dimensions and multiverses and the stuff that I said before we got going that I don't really like, but there's not anything that's much more comic booky than that kind of stuff. And it's classic Marvel, and it was really cool to see it adapted in this manner. Like I said, personally, I'm not a huge fan of multiverses, and even more so, I'm not a huge fan of the different iterations of Spider-Man in the comic books. But even with that being the case, I was charmed by the story and all of these characters and how they weaved those threads together with the idea of what makes someone a hero, which I think really resonates as well. The story carries a lot of real weight, which is always welcome. I mean, I talk about that anytime we review an animated movie, I think, is that it can't just be novelty and it can't just be for kids. It's got to carry some kind of emotional weight, and this movie definitely does that. But it's still fun and it's still playful, and it's also really funny, which is really important. I mean, we've seen so many iterations of Spider-Man and have had 8 movies that include the character live action, 9 if you count Venom and that character being from his universe, and yet they were still able to make this character and his universe feel fresh. I think that the villains are used extremely well, and the supporting Spider-Man cast is also used perfectly too. I feel like this movie's super smart, and it's able to spin a lot of plates extremely well, which is great. I mean, a lot happens over the course of this movie, but it never feels packed, it never feels rushed. Everything is super fleshed out, and every plot point matters in some way. And then not only is it a fresh and unique take on Spider-Man, and is not just fresh and unique for being a Spider-Man movie, but it's a breath of fresh air in general for the superhero genre, which is important given the saturation of that market. So my only complaint, I guess, would be that it's a tad long, but that's a drop in the bucket when you're having this much fun watching a movie.
See, I didn't feel the runtime that much. Like, I felt like I was having so much fun that it just flew by. But I will say that my wife went with me to see this movie, and she thought it was a tad bit long too. So maybe it was just because I was just loving every second of it that I didn't really feel that runtime. But I mean, I could see it a little bit. So you're not the only one that said that to me. So I get that. I will say that I am also not a fan of like the multi-dimension stuff. Not necessarily just Spider-Man, but just in general. I kind of group it in with time travel. And I know they're 2 different things per se, but the reason I don't like time travel movies is the same reason I don't like these types of movies, because a lot of times the movie will spend way too much time explaining the science behind it. And we both know that time travel and jumping from dimension to dimension doesn't exist. At least the technology right now doesn't exist. So why spend a ton of time over explaining it when it doesn't really matter? And what I really liked about this movie, and I'm going to say the story was simple, and it kind of was, but that was a good thing. And I think it was simple for 2 different reasons. Again, going back to this being an animated movie, and those are generally geared towards kids, you can't be super complicated with it, because then kids won't be able to follow it, and then you kind of lose your core demographic. But it was also simple in a good way because, again, it's not possible, so why bother, why waste precious time explaining it and over-explaining it? I will say the only thing that didn't hit for me in this movie was the motivation of the villain to create the portals. Didn't really hit as hard as I think the movie wanted it to hit, but honestly, it was more about Miles Morales. It was more about Peter Parker. It was more about the spider people getting home than it necessarily was about the actual villain. But like we've said in past Marvel reviews, that matters. The motivations for the villains matter. And I thought that this one was a little light for me, but everything else hit on every level for me that it didn't necessarily matter. Like, it's not going to spoil this movie for me at all.
Perfect.
All right, so we kind of already talked about the design of the movie, but I mean, I feel like we can harp on it a little bit more. Like I said, it feels like this is the first time we've ever seen a comic book come to life. That's obviously what they were going for. But there was a little thing, and I don't know if you noticed it or not, Tyler. My wife actually stopped me while we were watching the movie and kind of like was like, are we watching the 3D version? Because it kind of looked a little blurry at times. Yeah. And I wonder if, and this was my theory, I don't know if this was something that they did on purpose or not, but like when you're watching an actual movie, the camera can only focus on one thing at a time. So a lot of times when you have 2 people in the shot, the person that's talking is in focus and the person not talking is kind of a little out of focus. And I felt like that's what they were doing, which I thought was a really cool touch if that's what they were going for.
So I've read a couple people's reaction to this movie, and it's pretty much universal that everybody loves that this film resembles a comic book. And I think that there's a name for the style that they used in the animation, and it's supposed to be reminiscent of kind of the way comic books used to be drawn, if I'm not mistaken. So it was definitely done purposefully, and I wish I knew more about art to say like what it is, but I'm pretty sure that's why.
Yeah, I mean, it was a little distracting, but I think as the movie went along, like once you kind of adjusted to it, it wasn't as noticeable to me. But I honestly think that it made for a cooler, like it felt different. Not that this movie needed to feel more different, because it definitely is a lot different than most of the animated movies that you're going to see. But yeah, I was kind of impressed by that little aspect of it. But yeah, I mean, the animation itself was really cool. Just the certain shots, like him dragging Peter Parker through the city, like as he's unconscious, that was really, really just a really fun shot. And I mean, just everything about this movie hit on all cylinders for me.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, every time we review an animated movie on this podcast, when we get to the animation portion, we always talk about how pretty much everybody's got it down packed. But very rarely do we talk about somebody doing something completely different. And this movie does something completely different that I've never seen before. So, yeah, I mean, major props to the animators for this movie. It looks amazing.
For sure. So I guess we could talk about voice performances. I didn't really have any problem with anybody. Like, I mean, no one really stood out, but with animated movies, that's always a good thing. Like when I mean, we've talked about this before. We reviewed a lot of animated movies, but the worst thing for me is getting taken out of the movie and like trying to figure out who did a voice for this or who did the voice for that always takes me out of this movie or out of these types of movies. And I never had that moment. And maybe it was just because I was just completely bought in from minute one with this movie that it never took me out, or maybe it was just because they had perfect casting for the voice acting.
Yeah, I think that the voice acting was amazing in this movie. There were some surprise actors in this movie voicing some surprise characters that hadn't been announced in like the promo material, so I thought that was a plus. Yeah, I mean, it sucks because I feel like it's easier to trash somebody than to give them props, which I think is more reflective of us as reviewers, if anything. But for sure, I mean, I thought everybody was spot on in this movie.
So this isn't technically, I guess, a formal review, but I would like to give it a star rating and like kind of talk about, do you think, well, first of all, let's go ahead and give it a star rating, and then I'll ask my second question.
Yeah, so 4.5 for me.
Okay, yeah, I'm 4.5 as well. Do you think it will crack your top 10? Well, I guess by just judging by your star rating, then I guess it would have to.
Yeah, 100%.
So the debate for me coming out of this movie is not, was it going to make my top 10, but was it going to be my number one? And I don't ultimately think that it will, because we've rewatched 8th Grade, and of course we have Infinity War and Black Panther. Like, there's some movies that I need to rewatch before we do that episode, but there's no way that this doesn't make top 5.
Yeah, so stay tuned for me. I'm going to leave y'all on the edge of your seat.
Okay. All right. So, our next segment.
Thank you for not being shitty there. I set you up for that with the perfect opportunity to be shitty to me, and you took the high ground, and I appreciate that.
Which is rare. I know you've had a long weekend, so I figured I would give you a break there. But, yeah, so our next segment is just plainly called Comics. Tyler and I read a ton of comics each week, and we'd like to spotlight one or two. So what'd you read this week?
I read The Batman Who Laughs #1, which is a 6-issue miniseries written by Scott Snyder and drawn by Jock. So I guess he just has one name like Madonna. I don't know.
It's always the artists, man. Why are they so pretentious and weird?
I don't know, man. I don't get it. But whatever. I mean, I'll get to it, but his artwork is good, so I guess he can get away with it. But, so obviously this is a spin-off of the Dark Knight Metals series that came out. When was that? That was probably earlier this year or last year. I don't know. All of my time runs together at this point. But if you recall, I wasn't really a huge fan of Dark Knight's Metal. I think that it was style over substance, and while there was a ton of awesome Greg Capullo art and character design in those books, the story itself was kind of a miss. But the one thing I did like about that comic book were the Dark Knights themselves, and at the head of that evil group was the Batman Who Laughs, who I really dug, and obviously who this comic is about. So I wasn't sure what this comic was exactly when I picked it up. But given the talent and the characters involved, I knew I was going to be reading it and that I'd be talking about it on the podcast. So I will say, where Dark Knight's Metal disappointed me, this book definitely made up for it. It follows the Batman from the universe that we all know and love as he comes across a dead body. The dead body is Bruce Wayne, which of course opens up a huge mystery that this book kind of dives into. And as Batman digs in and gets to the bottom of things, as you can probably imagine, given the title of this miniseries, the Batman Who Laughs returns to wreak havoc. So if you don't recall, the Batman Who Laughs is a Batman from an alternate universe that eventually snaps and kills the Joker. And after he kills the Joker, a toxin that Joker had put in his heart is released, and it infects Batman after his heart stops. And Batman then becomes terribly evil. It's not so much Joker in a Batman suit as it is the Batman that has all of the training and intellect of the Batman that we know, but with no morals. Basically, all he wants to do is win, and he wins when everyone else is dead, or something like that. So it's interesting that this comic is exploring the idea of multiple Batmen, since we just reviewed Into the Spider-Verse. And as you'll recall, I just said probably like 10 minutes ago, I'm not a big fan of multiple versions of characters. But I don't know. I kind of gave Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse a pass, and I'm kind of giving this a pass as well. It's very familiar territory, but Into the Spider-Verse was about as superhero-y as you can get, and this comic feels truly like a horror book, which makes sense since Scott Snyder is a self-proclaimed horror nut and since he's written some horror comics in his past. So I think that the feel of this comic is pretty cool, and it fits in nicely in the DC Comics universe. Also, back to Jock. He is an excellent artist, and he draws the horror that Scott Snyder writes extremely well. So the art is also really great in this book. So overall, needless to say, this comic exceeded my expectations, and it sounds like the miniseries will have ramifications for the DC Comics universe through at least 2020. So I definitely recommend picking it up now.
Yeah, so I was going through Comixology this week trying to figure out what I was going to read, and then I saw this and I was like, okay, well, that's what Tyler's going to read this week. So we didn't even need to text each other and talk about it, because I immediately knew that you were going to read that, and so I could pick something else. And luckily I found one that I wanted to read immediately as well. So this is probably the most obvious comic section that we're gonna ever have. So Tyler got to talk about a Batman book, and I'm gonna talk about a Spider-Man book. So Miles Morales Spider-Man #1 got released this week, and I don't know, man. It's weird because we always talk about how they always do these cash grabs with these movies coming out, and with Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse just coming out this week, and of course Miles Morales is a big part of that movie. Of course they're gonna relaunch a Miles Morales Spider-Man book, and we always kind of shit on the idea of these cash grabs, but yet we always talk about them. We're part of the problem with these books, because we always talk about them on the podcast, because it's so easy. I saw this Miles Morales book, and I was like, I don't know that much about the character. I mean, I know a little bit of it here and there, especially with these Spider-Verse arcs that happen throughout the comics every once in a while. So I know of the character, but like I said, my Spider-Man is and always will be Peter Parker, so I don't necessarily pay too much attention to Miles Morales. But I was like, oh, well, the new movie and the new comic, it kind of works. It kind of flows off of each other, because we're going to take what we're into Spider-Verse and go right into comics, and I'll talk about this book. And I was impressed with this book that it didn't quite go exactly like the movie. Like, the movie isn't at least from what I understand, isn't exactly how Miles Morales is in the comic book. It's pretty close, but it's not exactly the way he is. And I was impressed with this book being a little bit different from the movie, seeing it, they're both being released on the same week. So I thought that was kind of cool, that it kind of stuck to what Miles Morales is in the comic book versus the movie we just saw. But all in all, this book, very exposition heavy, very like narrator telling us exactly who Miles Morales is and what he's all about as Spider-Man, and that was a little bit disappointing. And then once they finally get to the action of this book, there is a pretty cool scene with him and Rhino that I thought was pretty spectacular. I do like that Peter Parker's Spider-Man and Miles Morales' Spider-Man exist in the same universe, so they're not like different dimensions, like they exist in the same city. And so like Rhino is talking to Miles Morales like he's a secondary Spider-Man. And I thought that was kind of fun, just to have those two existing in the same city, in the same universe. I thought was kind of cool. It's a cool dynamic, because the Rhino has had such a past with Peter Parker as Spider-Man. Now he has this new Spider-Man that he has to deal with, and just kind of interesting the way that he sees Miles Morales as Spider-Man. So I thought that was kind of interesting, but there was this big reveal that was kind of stupid at the very end of this book that I thought was really cheesy, because it's kind of a cliffhanger for a character that was literally introduced earlier in the book that I didn't particularly care that much about. And I thought it was strange at the time when they took time out of this book to kind of like hang out with this character. I thought it was kind of strange at the time. And then it ends up being this big, I'm going to use big in quotations because it wasn't big. It was just kind of stupid cliffhanger at the end. So all in all, this book was pretty disappointing, especially coming off such a really, really fun movie.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is textbook cash grab stuff, so not surprising to me.
Yeah, so we just stop doing this. But like I said, it's so easy when I know we're going to talk about the movie and then just go ahead and talk about the comic. Like, it makes it so easy. But then we're part of the problem with these cash grabs tie in with the movies. So yeah, it wasn't a horrible book. It was exactly just what you would expect, just like a vanilla comic book tie into the movies.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, bummer.
For sure.
So, not a ton of nerd news this week, but I did have a couple things, and I'm trying to pull up the articles here now. So, the first thing I had was something that you actually sarcastically commented on the Facebook, and that's that they cast Victor Zsasz for the Birds of Prey, I'm trying to remember the entire title here. The Fantabulous Emancipation of one Harley Quinn, I believe.
I think you're missing a word. Like, I think it's like there's something else like in front of Harley Quinn. Like, they call her, there's some adjective in front of Harley Quinn. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But yeah, that title is stupid. Yeah. But I will say that when we review the movie, we will call it by its full title every single time. That joke won't get old at all when we review that movie.
So I know that I brought this up to talk about like them casting Victor Zsasz, but did you see Margot Robbie on The Tonight Show explain why the title is what it is?
No, and I honestly don't care because it's not going to make it less stupid for me.
Correct. That's my point. So she was on the Tonight Show and she was explaining why they made the title that instead of just Birds of Prey. And she was saying it's not a serious movie. It's a very funny movie. And that's that's Harley's little tagline to say like, hey, I'm in this movie too. And it's going to be fun because Birds of Prey has like this very serious connotation to it. And to that, I say, that's fucking dumb.
I actually looked it up. You are right with the title.
Perfect. I'm glad we could clear that up. But, yeah, I think that it's silly to say like, oh, we made this title super ridiculous to show everybody that the movie's going to be funny and lighthearted. Like, just have the promotional material do that. Don't make it have some stupid fucking name. I feel like really they just did that because they have to have Harley Quinn's name in the title at some point so people go see that movie because obviously it's brand recognition at that point.
Oh yeah, 100%. They just wanted to find a way to put her name in there and they thought that they could do it and kind of get away with it. And It's so stupid. It's so stupid. But Victor Zsasz is like one of my favorite like lesser known Batman villains. So I'm actually excited about that. But I have my reservations about how much I'm going to like this movie.
Yeah, nothing says lighthearted like a serial killer who carves tally marks into his flesh as he kills people. So yeah, super lighthearted. And then I think we probably talked about it on a previous episode, but Ewan McGregor's Black Mass too. So they are using some cooler, lesser known Batman villains, which I think is a good idea.
100%.
So Scott Derrickson is also in the news. He is coming back to direct the second Doctor Strange movie, which I am on board with. I don't know if you follow Scott Derrickson on Twitter, but I do, and he's been pretty vocal over the last couple months. He actually lost his home in the California wildfires, which is awful for anybody. But he's been kind of vocal over the last few weeks about his take on some critics that have come after him personally online for some reason. So he's kind of been in the news for that, but he's not done much directorial wise since Doctor Strange. So I think that it's pretty cool that they're bringing him back for the sequel. I know that I'm kind of lukewarm on that movie. I think that it's probably one of my least favorite Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, if I'm being honest. But I will say that, you know, Scott Derrickson's a very visionary director, and he definitely put his vision into that film, and it's unique. So I'll give it that.
Yeah, for sure. And honestly, I didn't know that it was even like up in the air. I figured that if they were going to make a sequel, that they were going to have him do the sequel because he did the first one. Like, I wasn't even aware that that was even up in the air. So when they announced it, I was like, okay, duh. Yeah, he's going to do the sequel. Like, I wasn't even aware that he wasn't, like, there was even talk of him not doing it. Because again, I thought that that was pretty locked in, that if they were going to have a sequel, he was going to do it. And I think one of him getting back to like him talking about the movie critics and stuff, I think he had a really weird take, and I can't remember what movie he was referring to, but like he was defending a movie and how like movie critics shouldn't, I can't remember exactly how he phrased it, but like movie critics shouldn't judge a movie by their expectations of what the movie will be or something like that. I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was such a weird take. And I was like, of course people are going to do that. Like, that's such a weird thing to be against movie critics for. And I wish I could pull up the right, like, I think he just went like on a Twitter thread about it. And I was just like, that's such a weird thing to be like, feel that strongly about.
No, I agree. But either way, I think that it's a good idea to bring him back, and I'm happy for the guy.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Cool. So, you know, a couple weeks ago, we talked about a very heavy nerd favorite subject, which was how long it takes to poop out a Lego. So I wanted to keep the analytics and the data side of nerd news going. And this week, Pornhub released their analytics for 2018. So I wanted to dive into that because there are some nerdy things on this list. So the searches that define 2018. Number 2 is Fortnite. So I know you probably contributed to that a little bit, Pat, but...
Oh, that's all me. Every single one of the searches is me.
But yeah, Fortnite was the second biggest thing searched on Pornhub this year, which blows my fucking mind.
Honestly, my wife and I won't even have sex unless she dresses up like one of those llamas from Fortnite. Like, that's our thing.
Nice, man.
So,
there was...
Yeah.
I don't want to linger on that because I really don't need visuals. But number 9 was also kind of a nerdy subject, and that was Bowsette. So are you familiar with Bowsette?
I mean, I know who Bowser is. I didn't know that there was I'm assuming it's a woman version of Bowser?
Yes, and you're going to have to, I had to Google this, and you're going to have to Google this because I'm not going to be able to give this justice. But basically, it's a character that was born on Reddit, I think, and it is Bowser turns himself into a female version of it's like a mix between him and Princess Peach. And I guess Mario gets tired of waiting for Princess Peach to stop cock blocking him, that he goes off with Bowsette, and I don't know. There's like this whole fucking story that's been made for the character online. So it's not even a character that's ever been acknowledged or created by Nintendo. It's born out of basically fan fiction. Yet it was in the top 10 porn searches on Pornhub this year.
Oh, are you done talking? I was Googling her picture and I got lost.
I figured that's what you were doing.
She's packing some heat. Yeah, I
you're not wrong.
Listening as soon as I Googled that. Like, that's interesting, man. Yeah, that's people are weird. Like, you fall down some weird, like, internet Tumblr, rabbit holes, especially I'll throw Reddit in there as well. Like, people talk about some weird shit on the interwebs, man.
Oh, for sure, man.
That's crazy. But yeah, I just, I don't know, man. The fact that, Fortnite is only number 2, like, I'm gonna have to step up my porn game. I gotta get it to number 1, man.
Yeah, number 1 was Stormy Daniels, so, I mean, obviously that has
that makes sense.
Yeah. But, they also, I don't know. Oh my God,
if Stormy Daniels could make a Fortnite video, that would, like, destroy the internet.
I'm not sure why, but Pornhub also released, Avengers character popularity on their website. So number 1 is, of course, Black Widow. I mean, I think that makes sense, but
sure.
Who would you think number 2 is?
Thor?
No, Spider-Man.
Really?
Yes.
I mean, that makes sense. When I'm not searching for Fortnite, it's always Spider-Man.
Exactly, man. Spider-Man's had a big year, so, I mean, good for him.
You can see where my head's secretly at if I went Thor immediately. Like, that was my number 2 choice.
You want to know what's funny? Is Thor is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th on the list. Hulk beat Thor.
Really?
Yeah.
That's crazy. It's almost equally as crazy as how long that we've talked about this on this episode.
I feel like we could have done this as a bonus episode because there's so much to say here. We should have
literally done just one episode of us talking about the Lego poop thing and then done the Pornhub thing as one long episode and just see how many people we could lose. Like, see if we could get all of our Twitter followers to 0 and Facebook likes to 0 and 0 downloads. We just literally destroyed the podcast by just talking about those 2 things.
Well, on that note, that's it for Nerd News.
All right. So like we said earlier, we are going to be reviewing Aquaman. We got to see it as an early screening, via Amazon Prime. So I will say that I was talking to a woman at work and she was super excited for this movie. And I was like, oh, well, I'm going to go see it on Saturday. And I was telling her about Amazon Prime, and she's like, "Oh man, that's gonna be so awesome! I'll be able to get to see it at home." And then I was like, "Oh no!" Like I had to explain to her how it was working. Like you don't get to actually watch it on Amazon Prime. You still have to go to the theater. So I like broke this old lady's heart as I was talking to her about it. But if you're not aware, Aquaman is directed by James Wan, who I think also helped write it among other people. So that it had that going for it. If you're not familiar with the character, basically Arthur, who is Aquaman, aka Aquaman, is half human and half Atlantean. And essentially what happens in this movie is his brother, his half brother, played by Patrick Wilson, is deciding he wants to bring all of the seven seas together, all the kingdoms that make up the seven seas together, and he wants to challenge the surface world, where Arthur essentially is a part of. Like, he doesn't want anything to do with the Atlanteans, but he's kind of drawn into this conflict to protect the surface world. And like I said earlier with Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, like, we always like to talk about our expectations going into a movie, and I'm not sure that I could have lower expectations for a comic book movie ever. Like, Aquaman is definitely the laughing stock of the comic world. Like, his character is really, really stupid. Just like, he was invented, well, I guess invented would be a bad word, like, created in a time where comic books weren't taken seriously. And the more they become so mainstream, the more silly Aquaman has become, like, as a concept. Like, he just talks to fish. Like, you see it in the promo material for this movie where, like, he's at the aquarium and he's, like, getting bullied, and then the sharks and the fish kind of, like, come over and, like, protect him. And as I was seeing that trailer, I was thinking, that's such a weird thing to be able to control. Like, he's a badass at the fucking aquarium. Like, that's, how often do you go to the aquarium as a kid? Like, once or twice your entire life. So that's such a weird, it's just such a weird ability to have. And it's so silly. And it's a DC movie, and I've made my thoughts pretty clear on DC movies. So the fact that it's a DC movie that has been essentially a dumpster fire of a movie universe, and they took the dumbest of their characters and made a solo movie of him, just, I couldn't have had lower expectations for this movie.
Yeah, so I didn't have high expectations either. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure this was the last movie to be picked in our Rotten Tomatoes film draft. I'm pretty sure I got stuck with it because it was the last movie and I had the last pick. So
yeah, I believe it was for sure. Yeah, because I wouldn't have picked it.
Yeah, so obviously neither of us thought that this was gonna be any good. I mean, I completely agree with what you said. I don't know how Aquaman has had lasting popularity, because there's been so many comic book characters over the years, and you talk about, like, how comics were written and it wasn't taken seriously, and that's when Aquaman was created, and there's so many characters from that time frame that aren't around anymore. Like, immediately I think about, like, the Wonder Twins. Like, they're not making a fucking Wonder Twins movie, and I'm not reading Wonder Twin comic books, but for some reason, Aquaman has had staying power, and he continues to have comics written about him, and he's part of this movie universe. And I think that part of the reason this movie got made was because James Wan wanted to make it. It sounded like they approached him to do the Flash movie, and he wanted to do the Aquaman movie instead. And I'm sure it's not just they bent to James Wan's will, but I'm pretty sure that probably is partially why this movie got made before some other movies in this universe got made. But I digress. Either way, like I said, not super excited for it.
Yeah, so we've talked about this before, but neither one of us had high expectations going into this movie, and sometimes that helps the movie. And having high expectations going into a movie sometimes hurts a movie, and having almost no expectations definitely helped this movie quite a lot as far as I was concerned. So if this is your first episode, we start off these reviews by kind of just giving a general overview. We call it broad strokes. So how'd you feel about Aquaman?
So before I dig in too much, I did have a question for you. So
Okay.
we did this with Jumanji last year, like you mentioned, and I remember that the theater was pretty empty for that. So I got to this movie early last night, and I still had to sit almost in the front row because of how packed the screening was. Was that similar for you?
Yeah, I don't remember the last time that this AMC theater was as busy as it was. When we got there, I literally had to wait for about 10 minutes in the line for concessions to get a drink. And then I literally walked in, sat down, because with these Amazon Prime, there's not really any previews. Like, I think there was like a longer Lego Movie 2 preview, and then that was it. And then literally sat down at the end of the Lego Movie 2. I, for some reason, couldn't remember the name of it, even though I just said it. I sat down like at the very end of it, and then the movie started. Like, they did a little like, thanks for coming to the early screening with like James Wan and Jason Momoa and I think a couple others that I can't remember, and then the movie started.
Yeah, same here. My whole fucking movie going experience was weird. Whenever I was wearing a Batman jacket, and when I walked up to the theater, there was a redneck outside smoking, and he goes, "You're wearing a Batman jacket to the Spider-Man movie?" And I said, "No, I'm seeing Aquaman, actually." And he's like, "Oh, okay." It was fucking strange. And then they had projector problems, so the movie started like a half hour late, and we got free tickets because of it. So, yeah, weird fucking experience. But either way, it didn't impact my viewing experience too much. So back to broad strokes. So this movie is loud, and it's ridiculous, and it's littered with tropes. But for whatever reason, I really liked it. I thought it was a lot of fun, and it's definitely far from perfect. But I think that James Wan had a vision for it that he was able to put on the big screen that makes an overly silly character work pretty well. And after I got out of the theater, I've liked this movie more and more as I've thought about it. Like, it's no Into the Spider-Verse. It's not even on the same playing field as that movie is, but I did have fun watching it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, my low expectations going into this movie, I felt like helped it, because I didn't really care if this movie did well or not. And it feels like it's such the typical like DC thing for them to do, is they can't get a fucking Superman or a fucking Batman movie right, but they can get a stupid fucking Aquaman movie right. Like, the whole, other than maybe Wonder Woman, definitely Wonder Woman is fantastic, but like the whole DCEU is a fucking dumpster fire right now, but they can get a goddamn Aquaman movie right. Like, this movie is stupid. Aquaman is fucking stupid, but they leaned into that silliness. Like, inherently he is silly because he talks to fucking fish. Like, that's his thing. And they really, really leaned into that, and it was really fun. I don't think that I will like rewatch this movie a ton. Like, I'll probably buy it on 4K, and it'll be a fun rewatch, and then it might just sit on my shelf for a while, and I may or may not ever rewatch it much after that. But as a movie going experience, I thought it was really, really fun. And I don't want to say it blew me away, because it didn't, but this movie was a lot better than it had any right to be.
After the success of this movie, we are going to get a Justice League movie where the Justice League is led by Wonder Woman and Aquaman, because that's the way DC would and Warner Brothers would interpret its success, because this movie is making bank in China, apparently.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Like,
Yeah.
they would, we had a similar discussion with like Deadpool after that was a thing, like the rated R superhero movie, and like people are going to lean into that. It would not surprise me, because they're such a weird run company that it wouldn't surprise me at all if Wonder Woman and Aquaman are like the leaders of the Justice League now.
Yeah, they're sitting in a boardroom right now saying like people just don't like Batman and Superman anymore. They want Wonder Woman and Aquaman. So
yeah,
no,
that's
it's
the
just
reason for
these
sure.
movies were made a lot better than those other movies.
For sure. So story wise, and I don't know if we necessarily should dwell on the story for very long, because if you start to pick apart this movie, it gets pretty ugly pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, overall, the story of this movie is not revolutionary at all. There are tons of superhero tropes in this movie, and there are just general tropes to the story that you've seen in other movies. I mean, you can easily guess plot points. You can guess dialogue before it comes out of a character's mouth. I guess what made this movie resonate with me was just, again, how much fun it is. I loved the adventure aspect to the film story. And I loved the relationship and the banter between Aquaman and Mera. And while that relationship is tropey as well, I think that Amber Heard and Jason Momoa have a good chemistry and make it work. I mean, I don't know, man. I know it's a weird movie and nothing about it is based on any type of reality that we know, but I think that's what adds to his charm a little bit. It doesn't get much more comic booky than Aquaman. And I dig that James Wan just fucking leaned into it and went for it. The main complaint I have for this movie from like a plot standpoint, but if you don't dissect the plot like you were saying, is probably the runtime. It's a little, I think it's almost like the same exact runtime as Into the Spider-Verse. There's definitely some stuff that could have been cut out from this movie, but overall I feel like Arthur's arc in the film is pretty good and most of the story beats lend to that arc.
I want to say that this was like 2.5 hours long, and I want to say Into the Spider-Verse was only like 2 hours long. So
gotcha.
I think this was a little bit longer than Into the Spider-Verse, but yeah, it's just when you think too long about this movie, I mean, it falls apart for sure. Just for clarity's sake, Into the Spider-Verse was 100 minutes long, which is obviously an hour and 40 minutes, and then Aquaman was almost 2.5 hours, so it was a lot longer than Into Spider-Verse.
Are we looking at the same shit? Because I just saw this Into the Spider-Verse was an hour 50.
I just looked on Rotten Tomatoes and said runtime was 100 minutes.
This says 157 minutes. Or, I'm sorry, an hour 57 minutes.
Either way, Aquaman is longer.
Yes, but there's a 20-minute gap that we're missing here.
I don't know, man. Blame Rotten Tomatoes. Anyways, where I didn't feel the runtime in Spider-Verse, there were many times that I felt the runtime in this movie. Like, there was many times where I checked out, and I think it goes back to what you were just saying. Like, there's so many tropey things, and there's so many times where this movie and this universe that they're building is so fucking weird that it kind of lost me in kind of the minutia of everything that was going on. And I didn't really care about what was going on. I just wanted to get to the next cool, weird thing that they were going to do. And there was a lot of exposition and kind of explaining everything that was going on. And I didn't need that to happen. And I didn't want it to happen. So I kind of checked out from here and there, especially, so at the very beginning, you kind of get the backstory of Arthur and his parents, and you get a little bit of that in the trailer. And I was kind of hoping that the trailer little bit was pretty much all that we were going to get, because I think that's kind of all we need. But you get like a 10-15 minute sequence about his parents, and I was like, oh shit, like here we go. This movie's going to be awful. It's going to be super boring. It's going to be essentially just Thor Dark World, like all over again, because that movie's super fucking weird too. And so I just thought it was going to be exactly that movie, except for with Aquaman. And there's a scene that we'll get into here with the action that kind of like snapped me out of it, but yeah, that scene right off the bat I almost immediately checked out of this movie. But then you bring in Black Manta, which I thought his motivations were super tropey, but it worked for me. And I kind of wish that he was more a part of this movie. Like, he kind of felt like a B story, which was disappointing because I really dug his character. And I'm hoping that they kind of DC kind of takes a similar route with his character that Marvel did with Loki. Like, he plays a role in the first Thor movie, obviously, but then he becomes this bigger character in Avengers. And I kind of hope that Black Manta kind of takes a similar arc Loki did in the MCU. So hopefully that's what we get, because I really dug that character. I will say that, again, if you think too much about this movie, you can kind of pick it apart. But I will say, as far as Black Manta is concerned, it did kind of bug me that they give him this armor. Like, they give him this armor and this technology that he has never seen before, and he immediately takes it apart. I'm like, what the fuck are you doing, dude? Like, I almost thought that they were gonna do the cheesy Batman line when they give it to him, like, do you got it in black? Like, I thought they were gonna literally say that, but no, they went a different route, which is, I'm just gonna take apart this fucking technology that I don't understand. So that kind of bugged me a little bit, but yeah, I kind of wish that he played a bigger part in this movie, but I thought that he was really, really effective. There's so many little things in this movie that if I sat there and picked it apart, this movie would just kind of crumble upon itself. But like you said, it was just silly and tropey, but it just worked for some reason. And maybe that kind of goes back to what you were saying with James Wan, that this was a passion project of his, and you could definitely feel that. And I think the performances were really great. I will say that there's a particular scene, and then we can kind of get into the performances, but there was a scene where they kind of tease this character, tease it, and then you finally see it, and it didn't work for me, and I really rolled my eyes with it. And that was kind of the biggest trope that I saw this whole movie, was this particular character. And I'm being super vague, not to give it away, but I don't know. Like, I can't even say who. I don't know. I'm not comfortable saying a whole lot more, but that really bugged me with this movie.
Yeah, I know what you're alluding to, and I agree. You could see it coming a mile away.
For sure. So, performances-wise, how'd you feel about Aquaman?
So, Jason Momoa's a panty dropper, for sure. He's not an amazing actor, but I think that he gets the job done, and he's charming, and yeah, he's fine. I'll be honest, I've never really liked Amber Heard that much. I've only seen her in a few things, and she's always kind of been generic to me, but I thought that she was pretty great as Mira. So I was surprised by that. I think Patrick Wilson played King Orm really well. He kind of sunk his teeth into it, so I appreciated that. Willem Dafoe was Willem Dafoe. Nicole Kidman was Nicole Kidman. They didn't really do anything out of the ordinary. I thought that it was not only interesting that Dolph Lundgren was in this movie, but it was interesting that he didn't blow either. Like, he was fine.
He wasn't bad.
Yeah, I was surprised. I thought that it was kind of, stunt casting. Like, hey, look who we got to play this weird fish person in this movie.
Honestly, it worked for me, though, because like I said earlier in the movie, like, it was very exposition heavy. It was a lot of, like, his mythology with his parents, and then you cut to, you get the Black Manta thing, I think, happens first. And then I was like, okay, maybe this movie's kind of cool. And then he appears in this movie. I was like, all right, I'm all in. Like, this movie is leaning into being silly, because you don't cast him in a movie if you want him to be serious.
Oh, 100%. For sure. And then, the other big players I haven't talked about yet are, I'm going to butcher this guy's name, but the guy who plays Black Manta, Yahya Abdul Mateen II. He was fine. Like you said, he was very stereotypical. He was a very angry villain, and he played that well. The biggest complaint I have performance-wise in this movie was the guy who played teenage Aquaman.
Oh my God, he was so bad.
It was awful. It was like there was one scene where he had to act upset about something, and it was laughable. It was truly, truly terrible.
Oh yeah. Like, it was hard for me to watch that scene. I'm glad that you brought it up, because I didn't put it in my notes, so I forgot. But yeah, it was really, really bad. But I pretty much agree with everything that you said. The chemistry between the two leads was phenomenal, and it's one of the reasons why this movie worked. Like, if you didn't have that chemistry, because again, the story is pretty fucking stupid. So if you don't kind of have that chemistry holding it together, it really doesn't work at all. So I was very impressed with that. I will say that I still think that The Rock could have done a better job. But other than that, I mean, not that there was any rumors. I just thought that my personal taste would, as Aquaman, I thought that The Rock would have probably done a better job. But I thought that he was a pretty cool second choice. Not that they asked me at all, but I just thought that it was kind of cool. But that would have been cool if they had cast The Rock. But again, not that they asked me. But yeah, I thought that everybody did a really good job. Willem Dafoe was like a good choice just because he's a weird fucking looking dude.
He fit in.
But I mean, he wasn't great. I mean, he just kind of did his Willem Dafoe thing. There wasn't anybody that was really bad other than teenage Aquaman.
For sure.
All right, so action-wise, this is where I thought that it was really well done. And James Wan, I mean, you could definitely tell it was his movie and it was his passion project. Because I mentioned earlier that there was a scene at the very beginning that kind of snapped me out of, okay, I might not like this movie, that movie might be boring or whatever, and that's that. I mean, it wasn't one take. It wasn't that, like, long take. I mean, obviously there was some camera tricks to make it look like it was one take. I would almost put money on it that it wasn't actually a long take. But when Nicole Kidman kicked some serious ass at the beginning of this movie, I was like, that kind of snapped me out of it. And I was like, I'm going to like this movie just for that take right there.
Yeah, that fight's amazing. That's a great initial action piece to set up the rest of the movie. I thought that was great. I mean, we talked so much through this review about how tropey this movie is, but the one place where it's not tropey is the action. I think that James Wan did a lot of great stuff that is unique to him and that is unique to this movie. Like the scene in Sicily where they're running along the rooftops and it kind of shifts back and forth between Mira and then Aquaman fighting Black Manta is fantastic. And then a lot of the underwater stuff is visually pretty amazing. So, yeah, the action is definitely what made this movie a lot of fun for me.
For sure. And then you kind of have the first showdown between Black Manta and Aquaman. There was shades of Captain America with that door. I thought that was pretty cool. I mean, anytime Black Manta and Aquaman were fighting, I thought those scenes were really, really cool. I will say, towards the end, you have this big showdown at the end. The stuff with Patrick Wilson and Jason Momoa was cool once they kind of get to the surface, but the underwater stuff, as far as like the big battle, seemed kind of like chaotic and you didn't quite know exactly what was going on. But all in all, I thought that the action scenes were really done well. That and like the chemistry between the two leads were probably my favorite parts of this movie.
Yeah. For what it's worth, I thought I saw an article about this, and I was looking it up after you said it. They're alleging that scene with Nicole Kidman at the beginning of the movie was legitimately shot in one take.
Really?
That's what James Wan is saying. I don't know how you can do that because there's no way Nicole Kidman did all of that. She had to have had a stunt double, but he's saying, I mean, it was cleaned up digitally. I don't know. I find that hard to believe because there were a couple places where I thought maybe they could have cut, but I don't know.
Yeah, there was a couple of times where it was like they were like the cameras towards the wall and then it pans up to the like it was a ceiling shot or whatever, and when it panned, I was like, they probably cut right there.
Yeah, that's what my impression was too. I mean, who am I to argue with the director, but it seems like it was probably not one take, but either way, still a really cool scene.
Oh yeah, for sure. Probably my favorite scene of the movie, just as a film nerd.
Sure.
All right, so star rating Aquaman out of 5 stars. What'd you give it?
I am giving it a 3.5.
I am also giving it 3.5. So we're good there.
That's you probably rated Wonder Woman higher than that, right? So it's not your highest.
I would say that I would probably have to I would have had to given Wonder Woman at least 4 stars. There's no way I would have given it less than 4 stars.
Yeah. So, no, for sure. Good stuff. You ready for nerd favorite?
Yeah, what is it this week?
So, nothing too crazy for nerd favorite this week. This is our last episode, as we mentioned earlier, that we're releasing before Christmas. And I think that both of us probably have a lot of Christmas things that we watch every year. Me more so than you, maybe, just because I think I lean into this season a little bit more than you do. You tend to lean into Halloween, but I know your wife is a huge Christmas fan. So that's just basically a long way of me saying, I've been watching a lot of Christmas specials. So I went back and I watched like all of the Home Improvement Christmas specials and some other Christmas episodes from other sitcoms and shows from the 90s that I grew up with. And I legitimately just want to know what your favorite Christmas special is. So for me, mine is a weird pull, and I don't know why. I think it's 100% nostalgia. It's, do you remember the Garfield animated show? Like, it was called Garfield and Friends.
Yeah, I remember it, because then you would have like the little like farm animals.
Yes.
They would have their little shorts. I used to watch it all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I did too. And so they did a Garfield Christmas special based on that cartoon. And my mom had it on a VHS for me when I was little. She had put like all sorts of Christmas type shows that had like Rudolph on it and some other things. And then she would just sit my ass in front of the TV and I'd watch that VHS tape this time of year. And I recently found it. They had it on iTunes. And I bought it for like $3 or $4 and rewatched it. And it was like this flood of nostalgia just ran over me. It was crazy because I hadn't watched it in a few years. And for me, I mean, it's not the best Christmas special out there, and it's not the best animated or the best voice acted or anything like that, but it was a big part of my childhood, and it was cool to kind of come across it again. So for nostalgia purposes, I'd say that's probably my favorite Christmas special.
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, there's so many. I mean, Community did a lot of, I don't want to say Halloween, like holiday centric episodes, I guess. And then 30 Rock has a couple of good ones. And it's really tough. It's such a weird pull, but I think like, I don't know, I think, what was the episode called? Like Afternoon Delight. Arrested Development was technically a Christmas episode, which it wasn't really a Christmas episode because they live in California. But I think I would have to go with 30 Rock. I think that they did a couple of different Christmas episodes, and I really like that show a lot. So I think just kind of like off the top of my head, I think the 30 Rock Christmas specials were pretty good. Like I always remember those being some of my favorite episodes, those seasons.
Perfect.
All right, so that's it for, I believe this episode is 220 of the Nerds You're Looking For podcast. As always, I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, subscribe, rate, review us on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, basically any good podcatcher you use, we're on it. You can also check out our website, thenerdspodcast.com. Comment, subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Nerds You're Looking For. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at The Nerds Podcast. Like us on Facebook. Follow us on Google+. You can also email us at thenerdsyou'relooking@gmail.com. And finally, vote for us for Podcast of the Month at podcastland.com. For Patrick Kuhn,
Tyler Hunt.
we are the Nerds You're Looking For. Take it easy, nerds.
Later, guys.